Today on RPG Boons, we're going to fix that half-phrase problem in the new 2024 D&D edition. Let's go. If we look at the 2024 edition of Dungeons & Dragons, we're going to see that if you apply simple Mendelian genetics created by the monk, doing some funky stuff with some plants, we can easily determine if you're going to mate an elf with the human or any of the races, what the offsprings are going to be. Now, I'm not here to give you a history lesson, but basically Gregor Mendel was a monk that lived about 150 years ago and essentially started doing experiments with plants. Now, these experiments basically gave the foundation for what we currently understand about genetics in humans. We already know that if you take a person with brown eyes and blue eyes and you get together, that the chances are those kids are going to have brown eyes. But in some cases, you have those light eyes. Now, why does that happen? It's basically because of this guy. He figured it out first. First man to think of leshies as a beautiful thing and even think about love with leshies. What we're looking at here is the foundation of his experiments. He essentially took plants that were tall and mated them with plants that were short. And what he noticed was that all the offspring were becoming tall. And that was interesting. But then he did something even more freakier.
Real freaking naughty.
He took those offsprings and he mated them together. And then he found that only 3 out of the 4 offsprings were going to have tall plants, while there's going to always be one that's going to be dwarf. And by continuing to do a series of experiments, he determined that there was essentially a trait that's called a dominant trait and another trait that's called a recessive trait. Now, if you have the dominant, like in humans, it's brown eyes. So in this case, being tall plant was the dominant genetic component. And so then he created this nomenclature. Basically, a capital T meant you were tall, and if you were little t, then you were recessive, the less dominant gene. Now he could go back and look at those plants, breed them, and essentially determine which ones are going to be tall or small, or at least know their genetic background based on whether they were tall or small. Now, he did a series of a bunch of other experiments, but we're just going to stick with this very simple tall versus dwarf sized plant. Based on this, he created a Punnett square. Now, this is how you determine whether or not your offspring were going to be tall or if they were going to be dwarf. If you have a plant that expresses both the dominant and the recessive genes, so big T versus little t, and you mate those together, you're going to have a 1/4 chance of producing a tiny or a dwarf plant compared to 3/4 of your plants will be tall because they have the T, the capital T, which is the dominant gene. Herewith come Lord of the Rings. Now we can take that simple genetics and apply it to your D&D 2024 edition game. But the problem is, in the current Dungeons & Dragons 2024 edition, there's 10 races. Which one of these has the dominating genes? So what we're going to do is we're going to take some inspiration from Lord of the Rings. Now, some of you may know or may not know that Elrond in Lord of the Rings is actually half elf. But if you look at him, he looks full elf. So what does that tell us? That tells us in Lord of the Rings, the elf gene is the dominant gene. So anytime you mix an elf with a human, it's gonna look like an elf. All you hardcore Lord of the Rings people, you know the truth. Let's skip all that. So this might actually beg the question, what was Arwen then? Well, we know that Elrond is half elf, but we know that the elven gene is the dominant gene. So we can simply apply his genetics here. Capital E, little h for human. And then he had a relationship with Celebrian, who is full elf. Now, based on the Punnett square, we can see here that Arwen is either full-blown elf, or she's half human and half elf, but because the elven genes are the dominant, she's gonna be an elf. So I guess the next question might be, then what happens when Arwen gets with Aragorn? Well, all we simply do is apply that Punnett square again. We know that Arwen might be half human, half elf, but the dominant gene is gonna be elf. So if she hooks up with Aragorn, who's human, he's gonna have 2 little h's because he's full-blown human. And if you cross them like this, there's a 50% chance that all their kids are gonna be either elf or they're going to be human. So if you needed some type of roll to make for whatever reason, this happens to come up in your game, your 2024 edition, you basically make a percentile roll and you're gonna get your answer. Now, on the other hand, what if Arwen turned out to be the full-blown elf dominant genes. If she marries Aragorn, has those babies, they're all going to be phenotypically elves because the elven genes are the dominant gene. Now, what about this?
No.
So now for your Dungeons and Dragons game, you need to decide who has the dominant genes whenever you mix two different races or species, and basically use this Punnett square. Now in our case, we said that elves are the dominant genes, which means all the other races should be recessive. Now it can get very complicated. You can create two dominants, but let's just keep it simple. But bottom line is, this is the reason why there's no half races in Dungeons and Dragons. You might be genetically half, but you're actually only expressing your dominant genes, and in this case, the elf. And that's it, everybody. This is just for fun, but if you really need some type of system to determine whether or not what your half offspring is going to look like, we have the Punnett square. Thank you, Mendel. Now you can use it. I'm Don Franco 3. This is RPG Boons, where we talk about everything RPG and how everything is RP. If you'd like to cut out my gibberish, please hit the subscribe button, leave a comment. You know I'll get back to you. Until then, see you next time.